In my household, it goes without saying that I am not the chief cook, and I am not the best trained cook. But some years ago, a couple of years ago, I decided that I wanted to learn to make fudge. So I found the cookbook. We have many cookbooks in our house, which mostly I don't read, but I found one. And there were 2 recipes for fudge. One said real fudge, and one I read to say fudge for sissies. So, not being a sissy, I took the alternative of making the real one, which was much more complicated. It had very precise instructions, which I attempted to follow. So I put the sugar in the milk, and I cooked it, and I stirred it. I stirred it one time too many, and thunk! It was one solid lump. And that was later explained to me by my wife, who understands cooking chemistry far better than I, but I learned something that day about the way the universe functions. I'll come back to that in a minute. So, this series of sermons, this is the second in a series of sermons in which I'm focusing on the history of the universe and how we allow the history of the universe to become the frame of reference out of which we live our daily lives. And I want to then look at why that's a worthwhile thing to do. So last time the sermon was on the beginning of time. This is on the first billion years. So, but first of all, a test. Last time, how old did I say the universe probably is? How old is the universe?
14 billion years.
Very good, we got it, 14 billion years. Okay, we're going to have a teaching moment in this one in a few minutes. So now, in the first billion years, the universe started out really, really, really hot. And everything was just going like a boiling pot of fudge. But it cooled down. It started to cool. And one of the first things that happened in the journey of the universe was hydrogen atoms. Somehow or another, a little thingy that we now call a proton, and a little thingy smaller that we now call an electron, figured out that if the proton would stand still long enough for the electron to get one time around and then keep going around, the proton and the electron could make a pair and they could hold on to each other. And all the other stuff that was flying around in the universe, most of it would go through and they would keep going. And what we now know is that when the universe snapped into hydrogen, and some were slightly more sophisticated, and they got 2 electrons going around 2 protons, we call that helium. And I understand that probably lithium, which is 3. So the 1s, the 2s, and the 3s, pretty simple stuff, got themselves organized and are still holding on. The helium and the hydrogen in you is probably the same 14 billion years later, holding on. And if they weren't able to hold on, we wouldn't have you. So we'd like to thank them. Now, they traded something. Because as you and I know, when you decide to attach yourself to somebody or something, you give up some freedom. You can't just go wherever you want to go. Because if the other one ain't going there, you ain't going there either. Because you decided to hold on. But they gained something too. They gained something that lasted through time. And that's a big thing. Now, the teaching moment for this sermon, I want to say today, I'll say it over again. The universe, throughout its whole 14 billion years, knows how to do three big things: communion, differentiation, and autopoiesis. That's a big word, but you need to learn it. Communion means the universe has a deep urge for things to come together and stick. Now, there is also a primal urge in the universe for differentiation. That is, for things to come apart. We'll come to that in a couple of months. And it's an illusion to think that the whole universe is a happy party of coming together and being happy with each other all the time. That ain't the way it works. Not in my life and not in the universe's. But that's not today's sermon. And autopoiesis means the ability of everything to create its future. Autopoiesis, self-creation. And I don't want to focus much on that today, but I just want to get it on the table. Communion, differentiation, and autopoiesis. And today we're talking about communion. Now, if we begin to understand, when is a better word than if, when we begin to understand that since the almost beginning of the universe, and since it started to cool down just a little bit, and things could come together like my fudge, if we begin to understand that that is the driving force of the universe, to find a way to come together and make a bonding, lasted relationship, that is a whole different story about the purpose of the universe than the purpose of the universe is for each of us to be the best thing that you can possibly be. And to heck with everything else. Because it's not the best that you can be. It's the best that you can be in a relationship so that the relationship is better than both of you trying to be your best self. It's a fine line. It's a fine line. I don't think the English is so good, but I tried to get it said. Because when the proton and the electron snapped into a relationship and became something that could last through time, what we have, a hydrogen atom, is far more valuable to the universe and to your fingernail or your hair or whatever. You got a lot of hydrogen in you. That hydrogen atom is far more valuable than either of those two little things flying around by themselves. And we need to understand that that's the driving force of the universe, and what that does is that changes my personal opinion of what I'm doing with my life. Because instead of my question being, what can Nelson do to be the best Nelson? The bigger question is, what can Nelson do to be the best part of a relationship with something else that is then better than either he or the other part of the relationship? That changes the question. And that, for me, is a critical change of question. It's a change of the life question, I think. I think it's a change of the life question. So, I want to say today that the thrust of the universe is to create bonded relationships that last through time. And that each of us have that opportunity to participate in that deep urge of the universe. Now we're coming up on Valentine's Day, and it did occur to me that this is a way to rethink Valentine's Day. And in some of my sermons, language, in all of my sermons, language is a part that I'm very sensitive. I'm a guy that's real sensitive to language. Gender biased language and racial biased language and all those kind of things are very important. And words are not jokes. And sometimes I've tried to say there's certain words we just shouldn't use. But there's some words that I think are good words, but they need to be re-understood. And some of those words have gotten so many meanings that they don't mean anything. And love is one of those words. Love is a word that, it's everything from I love chocolate to I love God. And so the syntax of those two statements are the same. They don't mean the same thing. So love is a word. It's a good word, and it points to something that's really real. But it's real easy. It's also quite easy to misunderstand and to romanticize about. It's easy to reduce it down to just being nice and friendly or having a warm, friendly feeling. Now, I'm all for warm, friendly feelings. But love is about more than that. And like that poem about the washed pocket handkerchief, if you go just looking around for love, it's very hard to find. But love involves a relationship in which the two parties, parts of the love relationship, it's a polar thing. I mean, you can love yourself, but that we're not talking about. But it's not just that they be nice to each other, it's that they establish a relationship that gets something done, that has some purpose, some mission, some direction. And when that happens, then you experience love in a different kind of way. I often run into, especially young people, and looking for a life partner, and always looking around, and especially with men, I always say to them, "Well, what is it you want to do with your life?" "Well, I don't know." I'm always like, "Buddy, you ain't never going to find a girlfriend unless you tell me what you want to do with your life, because that's what she's looking for. What are you going to be doing? What direction are you going? And then find somebody that wants to go in that direction." But if you're just wandering around, "Well, I want to be nice and friendly. I want somebody to be nice and friendly to me," you are not going to find. I mean, there are people that will be nice and friendly to you, but that's not what you're looking for. What you're looking for is somebody who will go into history with you. This week, I found out that my uncle died. And not surprising, he's 90 years old. But that put me, then I realized that makes me now the oldest survivor, the oldest descendant of my great-grandfather, or my grandfather also. And it's been an interesting thing. So then I spent yesterday, a rainy, cloudy, yucky day, I spent yesterday going back and putting the family tree into electronic form. So I was typing all the names. But what I realized is many of those couples came together to build something that lasted. And I'm now starting to reflect on what's lasted 100 years. What's lasted 200 years? What relationships, out of relationships, how did those things have long-term effects? And when the purpose of life becomes loving, such that loving means building a relationship that gets something done for history, then a new set of skills is required or comes into play for each of us. Because direction, the ability to determine direction, becomes an important aspect of our human toolkit. How do we begin to see the direction history is going and ask, how is my life and the life of my partner bonded together, contributing to building the long-term direction that the universe is going, or the community, or just me and my family, whatever level you want to do that. In relationship, that's getting something done. It's not just about being nice to the other person, though I'm all for being nice. Don't get me, and more or less I'm a pretty nice guy. Like I've said to people, you do not want to see me mad. Let me put it that way. But in a relationship that has a purpose, that is going somewhere, sometimes it's important to know how to push and pull. Say, well, no, wait a minute, I don't think that's going to be helpful to us as our bonded relationship. So there's a push and a pull dynamic that needs to go on. How do we learn to politely, effectively correct, help understand and clarify? It's a mutual relationship and accountability. And lastly, and this I'm becoming real passionate about this right now. Relationships require overhead. I want overhead. If there's me and there's you, and if we're in a relationship, then both of us have to put some energy into maintaining the relationship itself. That I want to call overhead. And that means doing things together so that the relationship stays strong. And that's an important category of things. Now, where that becomes especially important is when you get beyond the onesies and twosies. Say a group like this. This group, we can say, is in a loving relationship. You can come here just for your jollies and go home. That's okay. But that doesn't help this group. And it doesn't help this group get into history. So, to participate in this group requires putting some energy into keeping the group itself together and moving forward. Not just what you want or she wants, but what the group needs. That I call structural overhead, relationship overhead. And becomes especially important at the national and planetary level, because if your idea is that the purpose of life is for you to become the best person you can be, and him to become the best person he can be and forget about the relationship problem, then paying taxes and all those kind of things are bad things because they don't help me. But if me being in a relationship with you, and I understand that requires overhead, then I have to begin to ask for every single group that I'm a part of, what is the overhead? How does that look? And how do I contribute joyfully to the overhead? Like we take up a collection. That's not a bad thing. It's not like Susan over here, the treasurer, is trying to rip us all off. She's trying to remind us that if you want to be a part of this group, it requires some overhead. And that's not bad. That's the way it is. The universe has overhead. And we need to begin to be self-conscious about relationship. What is the cost of relationship? And being willing to say, oh, okay for that. And quit. Anyway, I've made that point long enough. So now, if I haven't, then I'll come back to it some other time. I want to say that the universe, in its 14 billion year history, has done 3 big operations. The first thing was to turn energy into matter. The second was to turn matter into systems. And the third was to turn systems into consciousness. And sometime we'll get a little printed handout and we'll distribute it to everybody that has that, but that didn't happen because overhead collapsed. But we are at a place now in the history of the planet, like when electrons and protons snapped into a relationship and made something, where at a planetary level, now it is human beings becoming self-conscious about relationships and building a new kind of global consciousness, just like an electron and a proton built a twosie, a little twosie. We're now at a big level. And this whole question of how do we build structural relationships at a planetary level is where the universe is. So, now, what can we do? Why is this relevant today? It's relevant today because I've proposed, in my opinion, a major change in the way that religious people look at what's the task. The task is not just be a good person. The task is be a good relationship. Be in a good relationship. Now, there's all kinds of ways to pervert that, but I don't care who you relate to. But be in a relationship with somebody, something. Charlene and I are having conversations about how to be in a good relationship with the birds, keep the water from freezing. That's a good thing. I found out, by the way, that if you feed the squirrels, then the squirrels don't raid the bird feeder, and actually it takes less bird food if you give some straight out to the squirrels and then the birds eat theirs. It takes less. So have a relationship with the squirrels. Anything. Relative to this congregation, I've taken this pulpit to opportunity to sort of say things. So the say things today is, if you're on a committee, think about your committee and how it's a little relationshipy thing. And if you're just a guest, or if you've been here a couple of times and are thinking about becoming more regular here, snoop around and try to find out what committees there are and get on a committee and help this congregation do something, because the committees are what does something. And if you're new here and you thinking about getting a little more involved, coming to worship on Sunday mornings is important, but being on a committee is also important. And if you can't find a committee, then find a friend that's not on a committee and start a new committee. And there's structural ways to do that, and I'm all for structure. The universe, I want to say, since the first billion years of time, the universe itself rejoices when bonded commitments arise. And when things snap together into a relationship that's headed in a direction, there's a kind of a cheer of the universe. And that's for me what love is about. Love is about establishing a relationship that is purposeful beyond just bettering myself. And so we're going to sing that. Last month, I suggested that we change the words of the song. So we did. We changed the words of the song. And this time, I'm going to suggest that we change our interpretation of the meaning of the words of the song. So we're going to sing Standing on the Side of Love. This song was written by a Unitarian. I believe it was written at the time of a shooting, one of those a mass shooting in a Unitarian church in Knoxville. I believe I have the story correct. But we're going so sing this song, meaning that we are standing on the side of building relationships that last over time. And it also may mean that when we sing our closing song, all I ask of you is to remember me as loving you. Understand that means far more than, I'm not asking you just to be nice to me. I'm asking you to have a relationship with me that enables both of us to move creatively into the long-term future. That's a different understanding. But for me, this is Valentine's month. This is the time. And this is the time to remember that the universe, since the beginning, has been building bonded pairs, bonded relationships. And so I look forward to working with all of you in building bonded relationships.